Welcome everybody. Thanks for making it so early in the morning. As we've only got half an hour and we have to cover the topic, which is the state of the Asian sports industry, which is quite a large topic, I'm going to shoot straight to the panel and get people's views on the past year, things that have happened in their part of the industry that they thought were good. I mean, Patrick had a great tournament this summer, so he can talk about that. Where the Asian sports industry is going. Indeed, what is the Asian sports industry? And we've seen record rights for the IPL just recently, and I'm sure Ravi will have a view on that. We've seen huge explosion around football, in particular in China, and in the last 12 months, and Edmund can talk about that. And then from a global perspective, we have Jim Glover from CSM, who's sort of maybe got a little bit of a helicopter view of Asia as well. So I'm going to start straight away with Patrick, just for some views on his last 12 months, what's impressed him in Asia, what's worked, what hasn't worked, how the tournament went, which was the ICC trophy, an excellent pre-season tournament with most of the big teams in the world, certainly in Europe, playing in it. So Patrick.
Great, thanks, Simon. Yeah, it was a very big year for us. We played 7 matches in July across Asia, between China and in Singapore. We moved it to Singapore for the first time. 7 big European teams playing against each other. China was the 3rd year that we were operating in China, and I think this year for us was a very kind of solid performance. The first couple of years we were working there was very challenging from an operational point of view for all sorts of reasons, but this year things sort of settled down quite a bit. I think the thing that impressed me most about China this year is that we saw really strong traction in the sponsorship business. We had over 20 sponsors around the ICC China, and I think 17 of them were local companies. So the amount of revenue that we raised and the amount of interest that we had from local sponsors, and also the degree to which the local sponsors in China really started activating their sponsorship, that was something that really impressed us this year. Other things that happened there, the China media market, to a certain extent, the bubble sort of burst. I think this was the year that happened. Many of the digital players are either not as active as they were this time last year, or certainly not paying the same kind of rights fees. So that was a very significant change. We also started working with CCTV this year, which was great, and also good to know that CCTV is still really a kind of anchor media company in China, very, very much so, especially from a sponsor's point of view. A lot of operational challenges still there from the police, the ticketing industry, the quality of pitches. All of those issues are still there, but generally speaking, things progressed well. Singapore, we came to here for the first time. We ran 3 matches in the National Stadium. Things couldn't be more different from China in terms of the level of comfort and the kind of operating security. Here in Singapore, it's extremely a good stadium, very experienced people working there. So we had a very good experience. The clubs had a very, very good experience. They thoroughly enjoyed being in Singapore. It was very relaxing for them, especially as most of them had come from China to Singapore. So by the time they got here, they were, they felt very, very good. The market reacted very well from a gate point of view. We sold more than 100,000 tickets, which somebody told me is more than Coldplay, so we'd take that. So it was very good, and we're looking forward to developing the event more now over the next couple of years. We have a long-term commitment to the government here in Singapore, so we look to develop it further. I think just in very general terms, obviously European club football is still incredibly popular here. Popularity, if anything, seems to be growing. The response from local fans, both in Singapore and the Southeast Asian region and in China, very, very strong. So yeah, we look forward to building this further in the years to come.
Thanks for that. I think we'll like to come back on a couple of points as we sort of go around. Maybe certainly discuss sort of some of the issues maybe that in China, operational on the ground issues in China that the industry generally faces. But Jim, I mean, Patrick made the point about sponsorship, and obviously that's a big area for CSM. So what do you see happening in Asia? Is it a similar view that there's a lot more sort of local sponsorship? Obviously, there's a lot of money coming out of Asia into the sort of global sports industry as well. So over the last 12 months, have you seen any sea changes, or do you anticipate any sea changes?
Yeah, well, we as a company have definitely seen the larger, particularly Chinese companies. One in particular, Hisense, who were a Euro sponsor back in 2016, and we did a huge amount of work for them outbound into Europe. And results-wise, I'm very pleased to say, were extremely good. And we're seeing a number of Chinese brands that are talking to us now about how to activate sponsorships across the board in the rest of the world. They want a platform for themselves in the rest of the world. So yeah, most definitely seeing a growth in that. And our existing clients who are doing work in Asia, HSBC across their World Sevens, etc. It's all moving forward in a very, very positive way. So we are very excited about this region. We're still relatively new. We've got 6 offices around the region, but we're growing, and we're here for the long run.
I suppose that touches on another point, which we'll come back to, which is what is the Asian sports industry? I know Patrick and we sort of talked about this on the phone. You know, we have someone from India and someone from China here, which are just huge all on their own. It's sort of India, China, Southeast Asia, other bits of North Asia, Japan, Korea. So you've got offices all around that part of the world. And maybe we can delve into how they sort of all differ. But Ravi, you know, just in India recently, obviously, as I said, we had the IPL record rights deal. I read somewhere that it was bigger than the last domestic rights deal for the Premier League in the UK, which is probably going to be overtaken fairly soon again in about 6 months' time. What does that indicate about the state of particularly the Indian sports industry? But does that have any broader effect on the Asian sports industry?
Well, I think, you know, the IPL in India, there's cricket and there's the rest. But I think the most important thing that's happened in India, say since the IPL, is the proliferation of at least a dozen other leagues, you know, across a variety of sports, from football to badminton, table tennis. They're launching a yoga league. You know, there's a whole lot of activity that's happened on the back of the IPL using that blueprint, and it's brought in a whole bouquet of sponsors and media partners that perhaps weren't supporting other sports. So, yeah, the IPL, you know, is obviously, I mean, cricket holds a position in India that is unique, I think, in sports in any country. But I think more importantly, for people in this room and for the industry itself, the whole ecosystem is developing. There's a long way to go. You know, it's still, you know, perhaps, you know, not as sophisticated as many other markets, but that's the opportunity. And from a sponsorship, you know, point of view, you have a variety of sponsors from a variety of categories coming in now, looking for their own place in the sun. So I think the IPL has been a great catalyst for the whole industry. And in terms of, because we're also discussing sort of the fan being in control, and I think that's one question, is actually how much fan engagement takes place. We'll come back to Patrick on that as well, in terms of the audience. In terms of fan engagement on sort of a mass level in India, just to sort of kick us off on that subject, you know, does the IPL set any great examples of that? How does that work? There are still the challenges of, you know, connectivity, proliferation of higher-end smartphones and so forth across the region. Yeah, I mean, it's a funny place. I always say it's living 4 decades at once. You know, it's moving incrementally in certain areas and leapfrogging in others. You know, with Reliance coming in with Jio, they brought 100 million, you know, people onto their platform in less than a year. So you're getting more people, you know, connected. The fan engagement experience is both sort of, you know, old world and new world. But what's interesting is the way these leagues are constructed in a sort of a sportainment, you know, is what they're calling it, is bringing a more diverse group of fans, you know, to the table. You know, you have leagues like Kabaddi, which had a cumulative audience of over 400 million, you know, and bringing a whole new rural audience into the market, rural sponsors, etc. So I think, you know, fan engagement, you know, is the buzzword now. Everyone's trying to master that, and I think it has many sort of strings to its bow, but it's all happening at once in India.
And Evan, in China, I mean, particularly the company is very interesting because you do a lot of activity outside of China, exporting talent, football players and so forth. Recently bought a Portuguese team. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, because that's interesting in itself, but also staging big events, boxing, etc., in Macau and so forth. What, for you, have you seen this sort of huge explosion, and then actually in recent months, I suppose, a little bit of a retrenchment in China with a sort of cap being put on investment? Have you seen that over the last 12 months, the hugely priced Brazilian players coming to the Chinese Super League, massive rights fees and so forth?
Yeah, I think in the last year you can see that there's been a lot of changes and a lot of influx of different properties coming into China. Where we've tried to put a lot of concentration on is internationalization of different Chinese properties or Chinese athletes. We think that in terms of enhancing sports, we really have to have very, very talented athletes, and we've seen that. I mean, last year we were part of the team that helped Zhou Shimin get a world title fight, and I thought that did a lot for boxing in China, where the grassroots of boxing has exploded. We brought the Jia Yuning to Holland, and now he's obviously playing for Werder Bremen in Germany, and that actually has helped enhance football in China as well, because similar to what Yao Ming did for basketball, we need to have very, very talented athletes that can sort of go outside of the sports to enhance the sport and to build that momentum. And I think that's really has happened in the last year, where we've had some really talented athletes come aboard and really internationalize different sports.
And the influx of, particularly Brazilian players from European football into China, and the huge amounts of money that have been spent, what's the trend there? Do you think that will continue? Obviously, there have been certain restraints put now on transfers incoming, 100% tax on the transfer and so forth. How do you think that will evolve over the next 12 months to 24 months?
Yeah, I think initially most clubs are looking for finding foreign talent to bolster their playability and their sportive enhancements. But I really think that clubs are really looking and spending more time on grassroots development, finding good young players, scouting them, developing them. I mean, that is the only way that Chinese football can improve. And I think that we've seen that where, if you look at the Chinese national team, they haven't done as well as they could have, but obviously they won the last few matches and they're getting better. But if you look at the talent that is, burgeoning under, I think we're looking pretty good. But I do think the Chinese Football League and the clubs themselves recognizes that long-term, bringing high-priced foreign athletes isn't going to help them.
Is not going to help them?
Not going to help them.
Right. Interesting. If we move to fans, and Patrick, a hugely successful, international friendly tournament. A limited amount of fans obviously can only get into the stadium. Most of the matches are now sold out. So how does ICC approach that? The clubs obviously want to engage with the new, building their audience in this region. So how does the ICC work with the clubs to make sure that it's not just people in the stadium that get experience, but almost around the world as well, because we can also talk about the Asian expat communities, if you like, around the world who also want to engage with these matches. So from an ICC and a staging event perspective, how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it works on various different levels. I mean, the first thing is the clubs, without question, are getting more and more sophisticated and more, in deep in the various territories in Asia, China in particular, I think. So they're there an awful lot more. They're customizing their digital offerings to a much greater extent, making them more interesting. I think they see the ICC primarily as a very efficient vehicle to kind of reach their fans in China and Southeast Asia. And their support through their digital platforms is actually incredibly important for us in terms of how we market, because they are, if you like, the first frontier to the fans. I mean, for us in media, I think I'd echo what Ravi said. I mean, we shouldn't forget old media. Old media is incredibly important. We had to wait 3 years before we were able to work with CCTV. That was a big breakthrough for us. So having traditional television is still an incredibly important part of the mix. But without any question, digital now is, every year assuming more and more importance. In China, we had, I think this year, about 140 million hits on Weibo, which was a huge growth, I think a 70% growth year on year. It's vital for us, not just in terms of publicizing the event, keeping our sponsors happy, but also then to use the slogan to engage with our customers and build a relationship with them over time. So digital is incredibly important, both to the clubs and to ourselves, and we'll be putting more and more resources into it in the years to come, for sure.
And Jim, from your perspective, when you see that beginning to happen, what opportunities does that present here in terms of reaching out to new audiences and so forth?
Well, we commissioned some research recently on behalf of some of our clients who are heavily involved in the F1 side of things, particularly actually focused on the Asian populations across the board. And obviously bearing in mind these are populations very much that sit independently. I think yesterday it was the point was very well made. This is not one region. This is a group of a number of countries, all with their own independent DNA. But the research that we did into F1, which was actually quite interesting, identified not this millennial piece, which I think we all do talk about, but a young audience that will engage in a sport if they're given more than just the sport. So it's about experiences, not possessions, is what we found out. And if as a sport you're giving the spectator either live or on TV something more, Ravi and I were talking about this just out the back earlier, if you're giving them more than the old traditional going to a sport, watching it and leaving it, then those sports are going to have a massive, massive future. The ones that don't engage with their fans, I think, are going to suffer.
So Ravi, from an Indian perspective, but also looking more broadly outside out of the region, how do you see that evolving? You're obviously, yourself involved in sort of more mass participation, which is another huge, potentially, I think, huge growth area across the world, but particularly in this region, mass participation events. How do you see that type of engagement evolving?
Yeah, look, I think from talking about the fan engagement, a lot of the leagues are very young. The clubs themselves are very young, so you don't have that history. So, the reasons why people are affiliating with various franchises, etc., a lot to do with the talent. For example, the Bangalore team is one of the most followed teams in the IPL because Virat Kohli is their captain. It's not necessarily people from Bangalore. So the city affiliation and things like that is just sort of starting to happen. So, the clubs are trying to crack how they can, draw fans from around the country. Jim talks about India, Asia not being one homogenous region. Well, India itself is not. It's almost like a collection of little countries. It's like a continent on its own. So you've got language issues, cultural issues, etc. From a fan engagement point of view. With respect to mass participation, when I got there 20 years ago, there was probably 10 formal running events. Now there's, I think, over 500, and growing. You've got companies like TCS sponsoring the New York Marathon. They've just taken on the Indian Marathon. So you're seeing Indian companies also, globalizing from a sponsorship point of view. So, like I said, what's happening everywhere else is happening, at a variety of different paces in India. And I think, it's both an art and a science in terms of trying to crack it from a sponsorship perspective and a fan engagement perspective. And I think there's a lot that India can learn from the world, and I think that's one of the messages that I'll give people in the room is that the whole ecosystem is developing. And I think from a commercial point of view for people in our industry, there's a real opportunity to sort of sell shovels in a gold rush. Everything needs to be done in India. India can learn from the rest of the world, and I think that's a real opportunity for everyone here.
You'll be talking more about that tomorrow as well, I think. Edmund, from China, I mean, again, because it's a sort of market all on its own, mass participation events in China, obviously we saw Wanda bought the Ironman organization. Where do you think that will go? Because obviously mass participation in China, a bit like India, sort of takes mass participation onto a whole different level. Do you see that as a big growing industry in China, or do you see traditional sports still being dominant, or is there space enough because it's such a large market for both?
I think that China is such a unique market because different sports can do quite well in different facets. So, in terms of mass participation, we do the Spartan race in China, and its first year in terms of participation was incredible with the numbers that we got. We did races in Beijing and Shanghai, and the numbers exceeded our expectations. But we're also working with groups like the National Hockey League, who definitely wants to come into China. Obviously, it's not a mass participation sport, but we're looking at developing grassroots programs, making sure that people are going to enjoy playing ice hockey. And with the KHL, the NHL having matches and games in China now, we think that's going to grow as well. So I don't know if we can specifically say, if mass market sports are going to be more popular than niche sports, but I think that there is room for both.
And you touched on esports then, I'd like to come back to that, but one thing, because obviously China has got the Beijing Winter Olympics coming up, we've got the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, we've got, I think we can call Qatar Asia, because it is, at least from a footballing perspective, World Cup, you've got the Tokyo Olympics. I mean, Asia is actually staging the huge majority of the world's biggest sporting events. We've got the Rugby World Cup in Japan as well. We haven't really touched on Japan yet. So is that an indication of, what's that indication of? The strength of the Asian sports industry in general, or is there another dynamic going on? I'll start with you again, Patrick, because you're a stager of events. So what's your view on the influx, if you like, of the major events?
Ultimately, I think it's a reflection of the strength of the economies, right? I mean, it's economic power. The fact that economic power, to a large extent, is shifting, or at least growing, in this part of the world. This part of the world can afford to stage these events. They're very attractive for the rights holders and for the sponsors and the broadcasters, because the industry is growing very quickly. And also, to stage any of those big events requires massive public investment in one shape or another. And obviously, what we're seeing is that these countries are prepared to make that public investment. So I think it's probably, at a fundamental level, those two things are probably the most important.
And from your perspective, Jim, does that present, a lot of the major events taking place in Asia, does that present issues and challenges as well as opportunities? I mean, how do you approach that?
Well, I think massive opportunities. I think just to pick up on Patrick's point, I think economies growing, governments wanting to showcase what they can do, and populations absolutely wanting these events to come to their shores. The Rugby World Cup, we talked about that yesterday, but huge amount of funding both from the government and from commercial partners. The Tokyo Olympics exceeded expectations in terms of signing up numbers of sponsors before anybody else in the Olympic cycle. So all these things leading to a conclusion that these countries are enormously behind these big sporting events. And as an agency that has expertise in staging and providing strategic advice to large brands, we see that as a massive opportunity for us.
And Ravi, I suppose one question that sort of leaps out is why not India? Why aren't these major events going to India at this moment in time? And obviously there were quite a lot of difficult stories coming out of the Commonwealth Games in 2010 in Delhi. Is that still a factor? Actually, is India the Indian industry focusing more on sort of internal events like the IPL, which is huge globally, or is there a desire to stage the World Cup or the Olympic Games?
Yeah, look, the Commonwealth Games certainly wasn't India's finest hour on many levels, but I think it's a question of when, not if. I think these events demonstrate that a country's arrived, and I think India and its current government really want to position itself globally on the same level as many other countries. So I think it will happen. It helps promote the development of infrastructure and other sports and down to grassroots. So I think I said India's like I said evolving at various paces. But I imagine that this government especially, will get behind, bids for major events. It may take a little longer than some other countries, but yeah, I think India definitely wants to hold another global event, and perhaps do it in a much better fashion than it did last time.
And Edmund, obviously China has held major events, and there are ones coming up. And I said I was going to ask you this question, being a boxing fan, and you being involved in boxing. When are we going to see the world title heavyweight unification fight in China?
I don't think in our lifetime. I think that's
Doesn't have to involve a Chinese athlete. It could be Anthony Joshua versus.
I think that obviously China is very interested in hosting big events, and you know, we hosted 2 large events in Macau with Manny Pacquiao, and that was sold out. But in terms of big events, I mean, that's what we're known for. I mean, we like to run before we walk, and so if we can host some type of event like that, it'd be great. In terms of a Chinese athlete participating on that event, I think that'd be difficult, but we'll see.
And as we're almost running out of time, we must get onto esports, because I suppose that esports is the ultimate in the fan being in control, the theme of the conference across, you know, music and entertainment and sport. You know, that is a fan-driven participation event. There are no real teams, right? I suppose there are esports teams, but they are fans who are the athletes. So, you know, quickly go around the panel. On esports, Evan starting in China, where do you see esports in terms of China and then India and sort of Asia generally?
I mean, the numbers are shocking when it comes to esports in China. I mean, you know, every single weekend when there's a competition or whatnot, we get different numbers, and it's incredible. So obviously, I think that you can see there is a process where, you know, more and more groups are going to be involved in esports. We see that, you know, there's going to be more competition on the sporting space. Obviously, right now, if you look at esports, there's a lot of combat sports, but I think there's going to be a lean towards sporting competition as well.
There's starting to be more conversation around it in India. There's been a couple of leagues announced. No real action yet, but again, it's a question of when, you know, not if. It's a young population, 45% of the population under the age of 18. I think you've got a few issues in terms of console gaming being relatively expensive for the average Indian, but as those costs rationalise, then I think, you know, this is definitely going to happen.
I think a lot of the games manufacturers are now, well, look at FIFA. I mean, they've now developed a system that allows mass participation, whereas really you and I were in the past the only people able to play against each other. Now they've opened that up, they've democratized FIFA, and they're developing some really, really massive opportunities for people. I think esports, yeah, it's, the words Wild West were used yesterday. I think for brands, if they're going to get involved in esports, they're going to need a little bit more safety in terms of where they're spending their money and if their money is going to make a significant difference. So esports will need to get its house in order, it will need regulating, and when it does, it will go from strength to strength. It's already massive. It's here to stay.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow on what Jim was saying, I think looking at it maybe from a media rights point of view, from a TV, because that traditionally has been, you know, probably the main source of revenue for federations and sports in general. It's very hard to see how something as popular as esports can start to make a lot of money from television if it doesn't sort of get behind a monopolistic federation that can essentially control the supply of the rights, because broadcasters, if they're being offered content from 10 or 15 different sources, that allows them to basically keep the price for those rights extremely low or at zero. And I suspect a lot of the E-leagues are making no money or very little money from television at the moment. And in order to rectify that and to capitalize on what inevitably could be massive audiences, they're going to need to find a way to, as I say, create a sort of monopoly product, right?
Yeah.
And until they do, though, I don't think they're going to be able to take advantage of that revenue source, which is a shame for them.
Interesting. So do what FIFA have effectively done.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, the big sports are monopolies, right? That's what they do, or cartels. Possibly, but certainly monopolies.
Very strong regulator in Singapore.
Yeah,
sure,
but I mean, that's what it is.
Like
they have exclusive access to the teams that play in the English Premier League, right? That's what it is. It's collective selling. So until you get that collective selling esports, it's not going to be possible for them to tap into that revenue. Maybe they'll get people to pay and make a fortune from that, and that's a revenue stream they'll probably have, but media, no.
Interesting. Well, we're almost out of time, so I'm quickly going to go around the panel and ask for predictions for the Asian sports industry in the next 12 months to 2 years. Patrick?
I think more live entertainment, more live experiences. I think that's something that is going to grow. The fans want to touch the experiences that they really like, and I think that's going to continue to grow very strongly.
AR, VR, is that going to...
No, real.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think entertainment and sport just converging in a major way. It's already happening. The Singapore Grand Prix has tapped into music in a massive way, as has Abu Dhabi. Great examples of where fan engagement is more than just the sport.
Certainly from an India perspective, I think you'll see the entrance of a wider range of companies supporting sport, both from a media and a sponsorship perspective. And you'll see more and more Indian companies going global. You saw MRF signed with 3 EPL clubs. This week you see the TCS sponsoring the New York Marathon and Apollo sponsoring Man U. So I think Indian companies will start to globalise also as their businesses become global. I
think in China, niche sports will really take a hold. I really think that different fans, Chinese fans, will want to participate in different sports and try different sports. So I think niche sports will really grow in China.
In particular, what would you say?
I think motorsports is going to grow. I think snow sports is going to grow, skiing, snowboarding, skateboarding, that type of thing.
Okay. Well, I think we've actually gone over by 1 minute. I think that's what that's telling me, because it's got a big red circle. So I hope, well, it was fascinating discussion. So thank you very much to the panel. I hope everyone out there, I can't quite see who's out there actually, because the lights are so bright. But I hope you all enjoyed it. And we'll wait for the next panel. I'm sure it will be stimulating as well. Thank you, everybody.